So collective illusions are phenomena where like a majority of people in a group end up going along with something that they don't privately agree with simply because they incorrectly think that everybody else in the group does agree with it, right? And so as a result, entire groups can end up doing something that almost nobody really wanted. So with that definition, it sort of seems like, first of all, how does that happen? And second, like what, that can't be that common. It just seems like that level of misunderstanding would be so rare, but it's just not true. So we have found these, and we're not the only ones. This phenomenon has been studied for over 100 years by different under different names and stuff like that. But right now in modern American society, I would argue name anything that's important to you socially, and it's a coin toss whether you're right or wrong about the group.
Welcome to episode 29 of People Are the Answer. I truly believe that people are the only answer to the world's many problems. I'm Jeffrey M. Zucker, a serial entrepreneur, here to learn how innovators are creating outsized, transformational social impact. Today's episode features best-selling author Todd Rose, who's also the founder of the Populace think tank. Todd and I discuss his going from failing out of high school to becoming a Harvard professor, the science of individuality, the importance of social trust, and much more. Here is Todd Rose on People Are the Answer. Todd, thanks so much for joining me on People Are the Answer.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Let's start off and just tell our guests, tell our listeners who you are and where you're based in your current role.
Sure. My name's Todd Rose, and I'm based just outside of Boston in Burlington, Massachusetts. And I am the co-founder and president of a think tank called Populace that my co-founder and I started when we were at Harvard together and then spun out of Harvard a few years ago.
Got it. In life, what would you say generally motivates you?
So, I'm actually I have a handful of motives that really matter to me that I've learned about that I try to, anything I do in life, I try to have these motives play out. The first is I need control. So I'd be the worst boss ever, or the worst having a boss. I can't have. I just need to have control over my choices. I know a lot of people like that. I don't do very well when I have to do what other people tell me to do. Along with that, I really love really big ideas with long time horizons that have the potential for big impact. And that means luckily I'm okay with not seeing the fruits of the work for a long time, but I just like that asymmetry of like I'm putting effort in and maybe it'll fail and nothing will happen, but if it does succeed, it could be transformative. So that's really important to me. And then finally, and this will sound like one of those answers to a job interview, like, what's your biggest weakness? Oh, I care too much. I just, but like in this case, I really deeply believe in a positive sum society. And so for me, it's about how can I live a fulfilling life and make my best contribution. And so I'm motivated by the idea of contribution without self-sacrifice, right? Where my fulfillment is actually also my best contribution to society.
Love that. Super thoughtful answer. Thank you for sharing that. And we'll certainly dig into some of those more specifically as we go along here.
Yeah.
So, where did you grow up and what was it like there?
It's funny. I think I've had the most sort of polar opposite living circumstances because, I've spent over 20 years in right around Cambridge, Massachusetts, which, arguably is one of the most liberal places in the country. But I grew up in one of the most conservative places, which is in rural Utah, a place called Hooper. Only claim to fame, this tiny little place was that Ronald Reagan visited when he was president. But the you know no street lights, no police, which was great for a troublemaker like me when I was a kid. Um, it it had a lot going for it, and I learned a lot. It was also like deeply sort of mono religion, like singular religion, and that was a religion that, at least where I grew up, put uh, they prioritized conformity to authority, which was never going to work with my personality anyway, and it didn't. And so, it created a kind of not a very good fit for me as a person. And so, while I appreciate having grown up there, I'm very happy living where I am.
Yeah. So, like you mentioned, you're a bit of a troublemaker. You weren't initially much of a student, but you ended up becoming one and an academic. How did that happen?
Yeah, that was if you would have asked me like how my life was going to play out about midway through, it would have never been, being a public intellectual by any stretch. But yeah, like you were pointing out, like school just wasn't a good fit for me. In part for the same reasons. School is really about conformity. It's about learning to do what you're told, not really discovering who you are, and unless you get to go like a Montessori school or something. But where I went to school, it was just a bad fit, and I actually ended up failing out of high school with. And I like to share this because it's like when I say failing out of high school, I failed out with a 0.9 GPA. So it's I feel like you have to work really, really hard to do that poorly. I didn't even get socially promoted. I did so badly that they kicked me out. And then shortly after I failed out of school, my girlfriend, who's still my wife today, but at the time found out she was pregnant. So imagine rural Utah, uh, fell out of high school, and you're gonna get married and start a family. And so there were I we had 2 kids by the time I was 21, and I'd worked like a string of minimum wage jobs, and it just wasn't going very well, and everybody was frustrated. We ended up on welfare, and, the road back really didn't I didn't intentionally mean like, "I'm gonna become an academic." It was like, what am I going to do? Because the last job I had before I decided to get my GED and go to college, there's no kidding. I I I drove around as a home health care associate, and I gave enemas to people. That was actually my job. And look, it's an honest job, and somebody has to do it. I'm just glad it's not me anymore. And I just felt like, well, so, something has to give. So really, out of desperation, I decided to get my GED and followed my dad. My father, I had a great example. My dad is the first high school graduate in our family. He then went to college when I was in grade school and really became a phenomenal engineer. And so I kind of had that model, and I thought, well, why don't I just go to school where he went? And so I enrolled at Weaver State at night. And I can dive in more. I learned a lot at Weaver State about who I am and who I was then, and really that's where things started to turn around and put me on a path toward more public intellectual work.
Well, it sounds like that was certainly a pivotal decision to decide to go to school for you. And I know it's something we've talked about before, and it'll come up later in terms of how it's tough to find the right fit for most people in education. Did it just so happen that the place your dad went was a fit for you?
No, that's a great question. So it was just like anywhere else. But what my dad told me going in is he said, "Listen, um, I don't know what it's gonna mean for you to succeed, but I think we can all agree that doing what you were told before didn't really work out." And so I knew that like when I had first arrived on campus, I had failed algebra 3 times in high school. And so the advisor was like, "Okay, you need to take remedial math, and then you're gonna take remedial English, and you're gonna take this." And I was like, "Well, that's really boring." And my dad told me, he said, because he said, "You don't have the study skills, and what you want to do is pick classes that were really interesting to you, so you'll stick with it and build up the study skills." So I actually inverted almost everything. I made very, very different decisions. So even in a pretty standardized environment, I was able to make sort of micro choices that created as good a fit as possible to me in terms of the kind of professors I chose, the classes I took, the sequence of the classes I took, and it really ladders up to probably the single most pivotal moment in my life to that point, which was this idea of the honors program, which I'm happy to tell the story if you'd like.
Yeah, no, I would. And I'll just comment first that, I mean, just going in with the idea of like, I'm going to work this the best that I can, I'm going to make these types of choices. I mean, that's It's really thoughtful. I mean, I commend your previous self for having that kind of foresight, honestly, because it sounded like a lot of things hadn't gone well, and now most people just like, oh, I'll sign up for college and just do what they say.
Yeah, it's interesting because, my family cobbled together what little money they had, and Weaver State wasn't expensive, but basically we only could come up with enough to get me through 1 year of school, and the idea was that basically I was gonna have to figure out a way to get an academic scholarship, or else I probably wasn't gonna be able to continue, and so I didn't wanna go back to the life I had. I didn't really know where I wanted to go, but I knew that I had to figure out how to make this work. And my dad's advice, that's really what led me there, which was he told me like, of course you got to listen to people. It's not like don't you know everybody's not stupid. Like listen to them, but I need to know who I am, and only I can know that, and then I can make better decisions about things that are likely to work. And I get bored really easily, and I just took that to heart, and I understood the things that would work and wouldn't work. And so even like the idea of, oh, take remedial math. Okay, that kind of makes sense, except for remedial math in higher education is the most taken and failed course in the country. So you're not getting the best teachers in the world, right? Like this is so if I would have listened there, I almost can guarantee you that would have been the end of my college career right off the bat. So instead, I just took things that really mattered to me, um, with professors that I could connect with, and slowly built up a better sense of myself and what I was capable of.
Yeah. And then you found your way to the honors college.
So this is, look, I mean, when I talk about, and we can talk about this later on around like my research on individuality and fit and for me, so I'm sitting there in a really gigantic lecture hall for a history class, which I couldn't avoid. I don't like those big lectures, but
No.
there was no other option, right? And
It sounds
so
like we're similar in some of those ways in terms of get bored easily, can't sit in these large lecture halls. I mean, if I had tried to tailor college more towards like looking to have success, I'm sure my grades would have been a lot better.
yeah, it's funny because we just internalize it as like we're so used to this being how school is that if you don't do well, you just assume it's something with you, right? Like, oh, maybe I'm not that smart, or maybe I have different talents. So, so I'm sitting there in this class with my buddy Steve, and I am just barely like staying awake. And the class ends, and we're like 3 rows from the very back. And I said, "Oh man, this is awful," And he said, "Well, man, this is nothing compared to what I got myself into." And he told me about the honors program that he was in. And so to me, I thought honors was just the same stuff, only more work. I don't know why I thought that. I was like, who would do that? Right. Like, and he's like, oh, no, 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 that's not what it is. He said, look, there's no big lectures. It's just small groups. There's never more than 12 people in a class. He's like, so you can't hide. You have to always show up. And he said, there are no tests. We just write stuff and we debate things. And I'm like, that sounds kind of interesting. And then he goes, worst of all, I don't even think there are correct answers, because he's like, there's no right answer. There's no back of the book thing. You just endlessly debate. And he thought it was like the one of the circles of hell for himself. And for me, it sounded like pure heaven. And so I was impulsively, the class ends, and the honors program was at the top of the hill. It had its own floor in the library, and I beelined it right there. I actually skipped the next class I was supposed to go to because I'm like, I got to get into this honors program. And I get there, and I rush in, and the secretary, a woman named Marilyn Diamond, is sitting there. I said, hey, look, I really want to be in the honors program. And she said, well, fantastic. The director's in, and let me see if he can see you. So she ushers me in, and I sit down in front of the desk, and I'm very excited. And I tell the guy, I said, listen, I really want to be in the honors program. And he says, oh, fantastic. We're really proud of this program. Da, 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 da. And he said, okay, just a few questions. We can get this thing done soon. He goes, uh, what was your ACT score? Because we took the ACTs instead of SATs back then. And I told him it was definitely on the sort of lower end of the bell curve. And to his credit, he said, "Well, don't worry, it's okay. Not everyone's good at standardized tests." He said, "What was your high school GPA?"
Oh no.
And I told him, you know, point 0.9. And this is no kidding. His response was, what point 0.9? and I said, 0.9. And he just looks at me and he was so nice. He didn't mean it rude. He said, look, you can't be in the honors program. And, what I heard was, we have standards and you don't meet them. But he was nicer than that. And it suddenly dawned on me, like, I just rushed into this and I was so embarrassed and I couldn't wait to get out of there. So I just grabbed my stuff and I apologized profusely and I stood up and reached across the desk and shook his hand. Thank you for your time, and so sorry. And I rushed out. Well, as I'm walking out, Marilyn Diamond, the secretary, her desk is right by the door. And as I'm walking past her, she reaches out and she grabbed my arm and she said, "Hey, listen, I heard most of the conversation. If you want this, don't take no for an answer." And I thought, wait, you can do that? Like, I didn't realize that that was a thing, right? Like, so she says, look, if you really want to be in the auditorium, just sit here on the couch and show him that you're serious. So I sat there for what felt like a day, but it was certainly several hours. And the director came out to go teach a class and he says, Todd, what are you doing? I said, I want to be in the honors program. And he said, you can't be in the honors program. He leaves, he comes back, and we played this game for a while. So after a few hours, I'm still sitting there. It's really embarrassing. And he sticks his head out and he said, Todd, come back in here for a second. And I went back in and he said, listen, tell me why you want to be in the honors program, because I don't get it, right? On paper, this doesn't make any sense. And so I told him about what I was learning about myself and why I thought this was a really good fit. And he said, well, look, I can't let you in formally, like properly, but I can let you in on a provisional basis. And so he said I could take one class, and if I did well, I could take a second class and would go from there. So I chose wisely. I picked a class called Plagues of the Modern Era, which was, first of all, it almost made me a vegan for a little while. I was like, I definitely know the difference between steak and ground beef in terms of what can really make you sick. But so it turned out it was really perfect. Like, this structure and this ability to debate ideas and have such a small group, it's just perfect fit for me. And I did really well. And flash forward, not only did I do well, I ended up graduating as the honor student of the year. The year I graduated with a 3.97 GPA in psychology and pre-med. And I actually got into Harvard for my doctorate. And I'm certain that there is no way that I would have got into Harvard, let alone succeeded there, without the experience in the honors program. And for me, I tell that story because, again, if you ignore our individuality and the idea of a fit within an environment, nothing about my background would have suggested, what'll really work for you is to go ahead and skip your remedial classes and do this. So the last thing I'll say about the story, because I think it's really important, at least for how I view it, is a few years ago, Weaver State gave me an award. I was really proud, as a graduate of the school. And it just so happened that Marilyn Diamond was retiring that same year.
Oh
And
wow.
she was in the audience for my speech, my acceptance speech. And I thought, I'm going to tell this story, and I tell it, and it's great. And the dean who's emceeing it says, "Well, Marilyn, why don't you come up and say a few words?" Right? And I'm like, "This is a big moment." And she gets up and she says, "Well, it's really lovely. Thank you so much. I'm so proud of what you've accomplished. But I got to be honest, Todd, I don't remember that." And I was like, I was devastated. I thought, because I had thought that she had seen this diamond in a rough, and there was something so uniquely special about me. But it turns out that the reason she didn't remember it is that everybody had a Marilyn Diamond story. She was one of those people that just believed in other people, and she acted on it. And so I was just one of so many. Now, what I love about that is, you know, when you believe in other people, you might think that it was such a small act on her part that she didn't even remember it, and yet it was completely transformative for my life.
I love that. I'm really glad that you shared it. Just everything that shows that you just doing the little things in life, being good to people and kind, it can go such a long way. And you can go about your day not even realizing you did it, and someone can come up to you years later and say you changed my life. So sounds
But
like
that's
she was an
exactly
incredible
right.
person.
That's exactly right. And I think we forget that, right? Like we all can be Marilyn Diamond. We can. And it doesn't take a lot, but it can have this incredible impact and on people's lives.
Yeah. Wow, that's incredible to hear, and amazing that you were able to make that program work for you. And it sounds like Weber State was pretty accommodating as well.
Yeah, look, it was great. I mean, to this day, I mean, I really love my time at Harvard, but I wouldn't trade my time at Weber State for anything. It was so formative, and it reminds me. The thing I took away from it is, I've been at the very bottom of our education system, and arguably, at least, on paper, one of the top institutions. And what I always think on that journey is, man, people are capable of so much. There's so much talent and potential out there, and we're just overlooking it, and we're not cultivating it in a way. And if we really recognize that fact, that everyone's capable of excellence, man, what a world we'd live in.
Yeah, 100%. Just believing in people and what they can do is just so important to our success. And appreciate you making that point. And so, from Weber State, you go into Harvard, and what was that sort of transition like? It had to be very different.
It was it was sort of like Wizard of Oz, like we're not in Kansas anymore, kind of thing. Like I was like this rube. Like we packed up, uh, our two kids, my wife, in a minivan and a little rented U-Haul and drove across country. But this is how naive I was, because in fact, the first time I ever flew on an airplane was to interview for grad school. So I was pretty new to outside the world of like Utah. So I'm driving along. We barely had enough money to get by. We had a little envelope with our cash. We What was fun is we convinced our kids, who were 5 and 3.5 at the time, we could stay at these nice hotels, or if you want to sleep in the van, we'll give you, half the money that we would have spent. We didn't have enough of the hotels, but they thought it was their idea. They got some cash. We slept in the minivan, but we get to things are working out okay. We get to Chicago, and suddenly there's these toll roads, which I'd never heard of in my life. I didn't realize. I thought you just could drive on roads, and so I'm like, uh-oh, like $1.25, $1.50. By the time we get to upstate New York, we don't have enough money. We have to choose between the gasoline we'd need to get to Cambridge or paying the toll roads, and I didn't know what to do. And so I finally was like, got to one of the toll roads, and I said, "Well, do you take checks?" And the guy goes, "No one's ever asked us that." I guess we do. So I wrote checks for tolls the rest of the way. Now, I didn't have any money in my account, so they all bounced. So it was very expensive, getting to Cambridge. But the 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 worst part. So we get to Cambridge, and we end up, within the first week, got in a massive car wreck. Someone ran a red light, totaled our vehicle. My youngest son's femur was broke in half. He had to have surgery. I had to spend every dollar I had from my student loans that I've gotten for this surgery. So we're starting off in the hole. It's awful. Um, I show up my first class, the first time I ever have an assignment in my very first class, by a pretty famous professor who I won't name, who's a mentor to me today still, but kind of known as a tough person. I get this paper back, and I'm really proud of it. I think, look, it's all going bad, but at least I'm a good writer. I'm good at this stuff, and I failed the paper. Well, it was like a C minus, which is a failing in grad school. And he took the time to write on there, handwritten, that said, "Look, judging by your work here, I don't believe you have the writing ability to succeed in graduate school."
Wow, that's got to
And
be a
so
real kick in the gut.
I left class, I like cried the whole way home, walking home. I'm like, what am I doing? My kid's in a full body cast. We have no money. I dragged my family out here for my own vanity. I'm obviously an imposter. Um, and as it usually is for me, I'll dwell on that for a while, and then I just get angry. I'll be like, I'll show you, right? Like,
Yeah.
and so I knew, when I calmed down, I realized he wasn't entirely wrong. So I had I was a good enough writer for Weber State, and I wasn't a good enough writer for Harvard, and that just was true. Um, and so the end of the story is I needed help, didn't have any money, and didn't want to go to the grad school writing because those were my peers and be like, hey, So I went to it's called Lamont Library in Harvard Yard to undergrad writing support. And I went in, and this young woman who she was a second year student, but she looked like she was 13. And I said, hey, look, this is the writing support. And she said, you seem like a little old to be an undergrad. And I'm like, well, I'm not an undergrad. I'm, in grad school. And she said, oh, this is just for undergrads. And I said, look, I really need help, and I don't feel comfortable going up here. And this young woman, this is sort of another Marilyn Diamond story. She said, okay, look, I get paid from, she was a 4-hour shift. She said, if you come at the end of my shift, if you will, whatever, I'll help you. And she didn't get paid for it. And she worked with me 3 days a week, all the way through the semester, and helped me learn what it meant to write at that level, to the point where I got an A in this class, actually.
Wow.
And so, and I never forget this, because to me, it's like I'm proud of my accomplishments. And at the end of the day, I know I worked really hard, and I do believe I'm smart and I have something to offer. But if it weren't for understanding enough about creating good fit, and if it weren't for the kindness of people who believed in me, it wasn't going to matter, right? Like, so
Yeah.
like it does
So how
take
many Todd
talent.
Roses are slipping through the cracks, right?
That's the thing. Nothing. The thing that bothers me the most about when people hear my story is, and I actually get people that explicitly tell me this, like, "Well, you're just so talented. I mean, that's why. You're just so smart, and smart people find a way." And I'm like, "Cool, that's a great story, and it makes me feel good about myself." But it's not really the takeaway. I'm sorry. It's an excuse for not doing anything else. Because I think exactly what you said. How many countless other people are every bit as smart, but didn't have the Maryland Diamond, or didn't
Yeah.
understand was. And I just think about, again, it's like we're missing out on their contributions, and we need them. And it's not okay, because we know enough now about what it takes to cultivate the full potential of every person, and we can do that at scale.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. People tend to just say it's because of XYZ instead of realizing, hey, let's try to fix the system to cultivate this.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, all right. So now you're at Harvard. You get your master's and your doctorate. You join the faculty. What was that like? What really drew you in there?
Well, it's funny because I I really fell in love. I had a wonderful mentor, a guy named Kurt Fisher, who was the one of the pioneers of this field called the Science of Individuality, that got away from using group averages and focused on individuals. And it was revolutionizing medicine, personalized medicine, cancer research and treatment. And we were applying it to development and learning and human potential. And wh- I really fell in love at the time. I loved being around my colleagues. I loved teaching students, and I just loved having control of my day, right? And one of the best things is you know, was a professor there. I taught educational neuroscience for a long time, and then personalization. And then when Kurt retired, I became the director of the Mind, Brain, and Education program that Kurt had started, that I was a student in, which was a lot of fun. And and the what was interesting, though, is at the time, I always imagined just getting tenure and being a tenured professor was like the pinnacle. But like, what I was feeling like is I wanted my ideas to have a real world impact. And what I increasingly felt like was that academia does certain things really well. They're really good at reflection and sort of that sort of knowledge creation that way. Not really that great at impact. It's just not built for that. And I felt like all of the interesting questions were happening outside of the academy. And I'm smart enough to know that I'm not special, and that incentive structures really matter. And the incentive structures in universities are all about single author, peer reviewed articles in the best journals. And you could go out and you could transform an entire sector, and it's not going to matter for tenure review. And so I realized that if I really wanted to do the stuff that really I was passionate about, I was going to have to think of something else outside the academy. And so um, I decided to, with my co-founder Parisa Rahani, we have been working together at Harvard, and we decided to take our lab and spin it out as a think tank, and that's where we've been ever since.
And that's Populace.
Correct.
So, how would you summarize what Populace is to just the average person?
Well,
Average
so
person, which doesn't
there you go,
exist,
right?
right?
So yeah,
Yeah.
the whole idea was back to what I said a little while ago, which is so my background's in neuroscience, but also in complex systems, and we know for sure that societies can be structured. They don't have to be zero sum, right? They can actually be positive sum. So you think about a free market economy, it generates abundance, right? Like where it's a great problem to have when you're arguing over a pie that's growing, right? And my view is that it's equally possible to have a society that creates not just material abundance but psychological abundance, that we can all thrive, we can all be fulfilled, and that in fact you being fulfilled actually benefits me. So so I felt like we had a good sense for what kinds of cultural conditions, what has to happen to our institutions and mindset to actually get to that kind of society. And so we took that, and that's what Populous does. It's really focused on driving a positive sum society where every person has a chance to live a fulfilling life in a thriving society.
I got it. I love the premise of that, and think certainly creates tremendous amount of impact with that focus. And was it your work in individuality that sort of led you to this? And if you could just talk a little bit more about the science of individuality.
Sure. So yeah, that's the first sort of tentpole idea. So it's pretty crazy because it's sort of when we say like there's no average person, it can sound like a bumper sticker, right? Like my kid's not average, and but it's pretty remarkable. So if you think about, especially in the social sciences, but even in the natural sciences, to the extent that we're studying human beings, we had an approach for over 100 years or more that was basically kind of strange when you say it out loud, but we thought it was true, that you could understand individuals by ignoring them. And so if you think about how most studies are done right now, like when I did neuroscience research, brain imaging, if you were in one of my studies back then, what we'd do is you'd come in and I'd put you in a scanner. I'd give you some task, I'd image your brain, right? And I'd do that for a bunch of people. And then I would automatically aggregate that data. And so we would end up with an average brain and we'd publish that. And we'd talk about as if we found some insight and we had just assumed that it applied to individuals because what would be the point otherwise? Well, what started happening when we got access to bigger amounts of data in field after field is when you started looking at individual patterns, quite often the average represented either very few people in the group or sometimes literally nobody at all in the very group for which the average was derived. And it was kind of embarrassing. It was, we were like, oh shoot, we can't do this. And so first in medicine, because I believe that there's like a moral imperative there, right? So if I'm trying to figure out how to cure cancer or treat cancer, and I know averages may not apply to anybody in the group I'm treating, that's immoral, not just you just can't do that. So not surprisingly, right, the field of personalized medicine or precision medicine kind of went first, and we started learning. Like take like colon cancer for example. For 35 years, the dominant average-based model of colon cancer was that there was one pathway. There's a precursor lesion, some genetic uh, alterations, and it manifests, and that's it. And that's all we could treat you. It turns out when you do it from this science of individuality, where you study individuals, then aggregate up, there are actually three different pathways, and we the sort of average one wasn't even covering like 20% of the people. So we're actually much better at this very lethal cancer, and this has been true across the board. I'll give you one more example because it's like kind of personal to me. Um, my colleagues in Israel. So if you think about nutrition, probably the most expensive problem we have in the country right now are metabolic disorders, right? Diabetes, pre-diabetes, stuff like that. So we all use the glycemic index to understand how much does certain food elevate blood sugar. Well, glycemic index is just averaged, right? It's like, you know, chocolate cake increases your blood sugar by this amount on
Right.
average.
But
So
it's
my
totally
colleagues,
different per person, right?
unbelievable. So my colleagues in Israel applied this new science and saying, like, how many people respond the way the glycemic index says it should? Out of the thousands and thousands and thousands of people they've studied, not a single person, not one.
Wow.
And so they actually did something about it. I don't own any stock in their company, so I can tell you about. Uh, they actually figured out that you that individuality wouldn't be chaos. They could use some machine learning techniques and stuff to create unbelievably predictive, personalized nutrition off of this. And they created an app. It's called Day Two. I use it religiously, and so it does deep blood work, gut biome, everything. And I'm a part of this science, and I was skeptical that it could be that good. And so I did the test, got the kit, got the app, and then bought the blood like glucose monitoring so I could actually check my own blood sugar levels. So I was doing what the apps were telling me. It is remarkably accurate. Now here's the funny thing though. So I worried about prediabetes just for my family, like throughout history. So my nutritionist, like when I first became an adult, said, "Oh, grapefruit is so good. It's almost like magical, right? Regulating blood sugar." And it's true on average. It really is. And so for most of my adult life, I had a half a grapefruit every morning with breakfast. So I get my results back. It turns out for me, grapefruit is the single worst food that I could possibly eat to spike blood sugar. It is actually worse than chocolate cake for me. And for my wife, not true. So this kind of insight that human individuality matters and that you can't ignore individuals. You can't just subsume them into a group and talk about groups as if you're talking about individuals. That has held true and swept every field of science that it's touched. And so and what we applied it to primarily was around human potential and the development of people's capabilities. Same thing applies. So we've got an education system, for example, that treats everybody the same. And it's like one size fits all. And then we have bell curve tests to see who's deserving. When in reality, everybody's capable of excellence, and you've got to understand their individuality if you're going to be able to cultivate it.
Yeah. I mean, I remember the first time I heard you speak on this stuff, and I just was blew my mind just to think that like the average doesn't fit anyone. Like, what have I been taught?
it's it's funny because we just assume this is true because we've lived in this world. In End of Average, the book I wrote about it, I told the story about the first time we figured this out was the U.S. Air Force. They were trying to the short version of it, and this is my cue. You can read it in the book, right? The long form, but like when we went to jet powered aviation, right, from propeller planes, spent billions and billions of dollars thinking we'd get better performance, and we didn't. We got worse performance, and they were trying to figure out the culprit. Anyway, the short version is it turned out they were designing cockpits for average body dimensions, assuming that it didn't fit everyone, but if you fit in it, it would be a good fit. Turns out literally not a single pilot was average on the 10 dimensions of size that they were using. And once they figured it out, they were able to design flexibility in the cockpit, and they solved the problem completely. And that whole insight led to ergonomics, the whole field of ergonomics, and led to things like adjustable seats in cars. And so we figured it out in the military, which is arguably the most conservative institution in our society. And yet, in places that are supposed to be about human potential and opportunity, we're still marooned in this silly idea that you can design things on average and you can understand people on average. It's just not true.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. I remember specifically that story and how, adding a couple inches, like pulled in like 80% of the people or something like that.
Yeah,
Um,
and if you look at today in the U.S., most of our top fighter pilots are women, and they were not allowed to fly because their body size simply didn't fit in an average based cockpit. So this idea of getting rid of average based thinking and group based thinking is so important because even something like gender discrimination in the military, like we were underestimating women's capabilities there, and it was a design problem. And as soon as you fix that design problem, you didn't design for women, you designed for universality. And what you got were a hell of a lot of really talented women, and a lot of people's lives are better off because they are fighter pilots.
yeah. Wow. Well, certainly appreciate you explaining sort of the mindset behind that and how Populace got started. I'm curious, how do Populace's efforts really play out practically? I'm sure you do research and things like that, but
Mhm. Yep. So basically, there's two really critical conditions that you need to get to a positive sum society, and we have whole theories of change and playbooks on these. So just the short version is, it'll seem obvious, but you need institutions to be aligned with the values and priorities of the public. That seems obvious in a democracy, that should be, but actually, let's just go back, like education. What people want from education and what that system does couldn't be more opposite. It's like intentionally, since this guy Frederick Taylor in scientific management in the 1930s basically said, doesn't matter what people want. The system's what's important. And now we're cogs in that system. So you think about, again, in public education, it doesn't actually matter what parents want or what students want or what communities want. What would you do? Unless you have the money to opt out of the system, your priorities don't matter for how the system functions. So we use our background in complex systems to build a playbook for social entrepreneurs and philanthropic organizations for how do you intervene in systems to transform them so that they can align with and stay aligned with the values and priorities of the public. So this is important because if we're cultivating the full range of people's potential, we can't just arbitrarily and artificially narrow and say, you know what, we don't care about art, we don't care about this, we're just going to teach reading, writing. You don't get to make that decision. The people get to make that decision. And so on the system side, we do that. On the culture side, all that matters from our perspective is we have to trust one another. And it's so funny whenever we think about trust, what folks report back to us is, "Oh, we don't have trust in our institutions or trust in our elites." And I'm like, "I don't care. I don't need to trust the government. The government should be accountable and be transparent. We need to have what's called high social trust. We have to trust each other, right? As people, because if we don't trust each other, then we try to control each other, which is where we're at right now in America, rather than letting each other make decisions for ourselves in our own lives. So we've got an entire playbook about how you drive higher levels of social trust. Um, Both of those things, and the last thing I'll say is what we're really most known for right now, which is not what I set out to do, but both transforming institutions and driving high levels of social trust. Both of our theories of change there depend on having a very accurate understanding of what the American public really wants and what they believe. And so the problem there, and this is what gets to like our current work on what we call collective illusions, is so we're doing public opinion like everybody else around in 2016, and then the election happens, and it's like, what what just happened? Like people weren't telling the truth to pollsters about what they thought, and then we're just surprised by the private behavior. So we actually spent a lot of time digging into academic literature, business literature around where are the methods that are capable of getting around social pressure, that distorting effect, and put together methods and developed an approach to what we call private opinion research. And we do a lot of that. Probably have more private opinion data on the American public than anybody else in the country. And when we did that, what we found is that consistently, over and over again, the American public shares so many values and priorities in common across demographics, but they are completely convinced that that's not true. They're completely convinced that everybody else, the majority disagrees with them when in fact it's not true. So we can talk more about that, but that's what led us to think we're not getting to a high trust culture. We're not getting to transforming systems if we're spectacularly wrong about each other.
yeah, wow. Well, we're definitely going to dig in a little more on that. I think that's really remarkable stuff, and um, I want to talk a little bit about education as well. But I wanted to just briefly go over some of your books. So, I have it down as you have 4 books. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. So, Square Peg, was that the first one?
Yeah, so Square Peg was a memoir, which is kind of funny because it was like like 2013. It's like, how much of my life am I supposed to talk about? But I it happened because some reporter had interviewed me for a book she was writing, and the president of the publishing house said, "Why don't we have a book about this guy?" So I'd never even thought about writing a book, and so I wrote that. It sold about as well as you could imagine a memoir would sell, like at least that one. I'm proud of it. I got to talk about my mom and my grandma and people who really mattered to me. Um, but yeah, so Square Peg, uh, End of Average is the first real big book, which was, bringing that science of individuality to the general public. I'm super proud that that became a bestseller. Um, the second book, though, was Dark Horse, and I'm going to tell you just briefly how that came about. So I'm writing End of Average, and I was profiling companies that I thought had done a great job harnessing individuality, right? Whether it was Costco, Zoho, some of these big, even Google to a point. And when I was at these companies, I kept running into really, really amazing individuals doing cool stuff. And when I would ask them about their background, they had these really remarkable, out of nowhere stories. Like, how did you get here? I was interested in that, but I didn't have time, and it wasn't really part of the book. And but I kept noodling on it, and I decided with a colleague of mine, we started what's called the Dark Horse Project at Harvard, and we did the largest qualitative study of people who had been successful that nobody saw coming. And I was just in honestly, I just didn't know what I'd find, but I was just curious about it. And I sort of thought that what would it take to buck the system, right? And in my mind, I had, Richard Branson, kind of like this iconic, and Sir Richard really does. He just gets off on being a contrarian. He'll just go against the grain and love it. And I sort of assumed maybe you would have to have that personality to deviate from a standardized system. That's not what we found. And pretty quickly, what we found across all walks of life is the thing they had in common was they had a completely different view of what success meant to them. So most people would just try to achieve excellence the way the system defined it or other people defined it, with the hope that they'd be happy on the back end. These folks prioritized fulfillment. It was about knowing who you are, what motivates you, and pursuing that with really almost not even thinking about the outcome. It was pretty crazy. And I felt like there was enough there that could be instructive about how most of us want to live our lives. And so that became a book, which I'm really proud of, about what it means to pursue a fulfilling life. And I thought it was accessible to anybody. So that led us to this broader space. At Populace, we also turned that into the largest study ever on the general public's views of a successful life. And we found the same things, not just dark horses. Like, we just don't care about the normal trappings of success, but we're so convinced everybody else does that we keep chasing it. So, yeah.
And that sounds like that sort of led into what you've gotten into with your book, Collective Illusions.
Yeah. So it's funny. I am still to this day shocked at the prevalence of these collective illusions. But let me just briefly give a definition for that, and then we'll kind of talk about how we came to it. But so collective illusions are phenomena where, like, a majority of people in a group end up going along with something that they don't privately agree with, simply because they incorrectly think that everybody else in the group does agree with it, right? And so as a result, entire groups can end up doing something that almost nobody really wanted. So with that definition, it sort of seems like, first of all, how does that happen? And second, like, what, that can't be that common. It just seems like that level of misunderstanding would be so rare, but it's just not true. So we have found these, and we're not the only ones. This phenomenon has been studied for over 100 years by different under different names and stuff like that. But right now in modern American society, I would argue, name anything that's important to you socially, and it's a coin toss whether you're right or wrong about the group. I mean, we're just wrong about each other. And we can talk about sort of what that means in terms of conformity and what's happening. But I believe these collective illusions are the single biggest invisible threat to free society right now.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I recently finished the book. I just astounding stuff in there, and it's so incredibly applicable in our current environment. Um, you know how how do we deal with this in terms of it being a barrier to a truly free society? You know, I think if you could talk about maybe the social media and how that's affecting our society right
Yeah.
now.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me just step back and say, like, so how do these form? Because it's not like a bad actor or media. It's actually how our brains are wired, and this will make sense in terms of social media. So the two things you got to know about your brain to understand collective illusions. First is we all have a bias to conformity to our groups. Like, we are hardwired to prefer to be with our groups, not against those groups. And in the book, I lay out I think some pretty profound studies that other folks have done about just how hardwired this is. So even someone like me who thinks I prefer to go on my own, I like even me, I care. And it's painful when you go against your group. So there we have this conformity bias. We all do. But here's the second thing, and it's just our brains are spectacularly bad at estimating group consensus because we've evolved to have this shortcut to guess it, which is our brains assume the loudest voices repeated the most are the majority. Like, I guess if you were back in the day when we were in like groups of like 150 people, that might have worked. But today, it's a spectacular liability, and in part because of social media, right? Because so if you just think about like Twitter alone, so we know from research that about 80% of all content on Twitter is generated by 10% of the users. Like, and what it would be bad enough. That's bad enough. But at least if they were representative of the rest of us, maybe it'd be okay. But according to Pew Research, that 10% isn't remotely representative of the American public. They tend to be extreme on almost every social issue. But if you just take that, you can see the problem here. If only 10% of people hold an opinion, but you think it's 80%, well, your brain's going to assume that's the majority. And if you are not comfortable going against your group, then you're going to say nothing, right? You're going to self silence and just go along to get along. But if enough of us do that, if enough of us self silence, then the only voices that anyone's hearing from are from the fringe. And the result's going to be a collective illusion. And this is why it's so troubling, research from Cato, and also we've replicated the same data with the same results, which is right now in America, about 2/3 of people admit to self-silencing. We're just not being honest with each other about what we think. And we sort of feel like there's not a lot of consequence to that. But if you understand collective illusions, this conformity to something the group didn't even want means not only are you harming your own fulfillment, right? You're compromising your own values and priorities, but you're actually leading the group astray. Like your conformity is convincing everybody else in the group that this is what we want. And so, and you're seeing this over and over again, and we can talk about some of them. I mean, our politics are riddled with them, our social lives are riddled with them, and it is tearing at the very fabric of American society.
I mean, there's so many Americans that are just scrolling through their various feeds every day, and if they see one topic over and over pointed the same way, they're like, "Oh, that must be what everyone thinks," right? And especially because these algorithms tailor us to what we want to see as well, so
Yeah,
it seems like
and
a
it's even
recipe for
worse. Yeah,
disaster.
it's even worse because what folks at like Facebook figured out was that what we really want, despite what we say, is we want to be angry. Like engagement, like rage is a great engagement driver. Even though if you ask people, say, "Oh no, I want the good news." You want to be mad. Like being angry, negativity bias is powerful, and it will keep you sort of doom scrolling, and so the problem is that like that aspect of it and the way those algorithms are structured is they also allow social bots to play an outsized role. And what drives me crazy about people saying, oh, like Russia interfered in 2016 election, sort of, they didn't spread a lot of lies. What they did and what China does right now on steroids is they have these bots that go into say like Twitter, and they'll analyze sentiment in liberal Twitter, conservative Twitter. They will find fringe ideas, and then they will just swarm and retweet the hell out of them. And it will drive perception of group consensus. And it just leads us to tear ourselves apart. And it's pretty bad. And I'll tell you, like, just to give your audience a sense of within our political structure, and no one's free of this. We're all trapped, including our politicians. On the left, there is no bigger collective illusion than the defund the police movement, which, so it's interesting. In public, you can get a majority of Democrats to say they support that. In private, it's less than 9%. So, but if my identity is tied to my politics, and I think, well, this is what my group wants, then I will go with it. Now, luckily, that illusion got shattered as soon as they put it to a vote in Minneapolis, right? Like where it went down in flames. On the right, the biggest illusion, and we've got plenty of data on this, is the 2020 election being stolen. So publicly, you'll get 57% of Republican voters to say, "Yeah, the election was stolen." In private, it's closer to 14%. So think about the danger right now, where even in like if we just stopped, we think we know what our groups think. Imagine if you're a registered Republican right now who goes, "Look, there might have been some irregularities, but I don't think the election was rigged." That's actually what the mainstream Republican view is in private. If you realize that most other Republicans agree with you, what would you do tomorrow? Would you continue to like say nothing? Would you continue to lie because you want to block? No, you'd tell the truth, and this illusion would be over. And so these illusions benefit a fringe that doesn't actually have power without them, and there's no way out of them. There really isn't. We can do some things there. No, let me say there is a way out. There's no way out of them if we don't commit to some certain things, and it's pretty straightforward. There are some things that our technologies can do. I'm really happy with Elon Musk and some of his proposals around Twitter. I mean, it's not everything, but like dumping the bots is critical because it allows us to be manipulated into the illusions. Certifying people rather than just elites goes a long way because it turns out when your own name's on the line, you're less likely to be super vocal on fringe stuff. But at the end of the day, there's no tech solution here, really. It's on us. And this will sound obvious and almost to the point of like, but this is the way out. We have to find the moral courage to be honest with each other about what we believe, and we have to find the civic courage to make it safe for other people to do the same thing.
So in practicality, does that mean, say someone like me, I don't post a ton on social media, but like I see stuff I disagree with. Does my action that I need to be taking like actually go out and, post more? Or like what is the action that the
It's
citizen that wants the
Yeah,
collective to rise up, the actual, sane 80% or whatever it is that want to push that up?
yep. So I would argue that there's no hope on social media because even when we try our best, it's a fun house of mirrors. It is just the nature of its dynamic where you've given everyone a voice, which I think is good. And people fringe folks tend to be more passionate about their views, almost by definition, right? Like it's something I really care about. The rest of us like, I could take it or leave it. I'm not going to be out there like really loud about it. So you're going to get distortion there. What we control and what really matters is whether we allow those distortions to affect how we treat one another in real life. And the thing is that like this is why it drives me crazy that the fringes on both sides of our politics actually, it's like the horseshoe theory, right? The fringes look a lot more similar than they'd like to believe. These authoritarian streaks, this chipping away at norms of free speech and tolerance. We have to defend those. We have to. And the willingness to let those go, whether it's on the side of social justice or the far right, is awful. And the consequences for us will be more and more illusions and more miserable lives for all of us. The good news with collective illusions, though, is this: they're powerful when they're enforced, but they're incredibly fragile because they're lies. And history has shown that when we start to chip away at those by just being honest with each other, and there's ways to disagree without being disagreeable. Like we can do that. These illusions tend to shatter fast, right? They tend to create what's called bandwagon change because suddenly you're seeing this right now with a little bit of cultural reset around free speech just from having Elon Musk take a stand. And I'm not trying to make him into the hero of everybody, but I am saying he has a lot of power and influence, and his willingness not to toe the line and start to defend some basic principle that most people thought we all agreed on, and we still do in private, we just don't think people do, goes a really long way. And you start to see other people speak up, and then it just snowballs. So, what we found throughout history is when we can get that courage to be honest with each other, the illusions shatter, and social change can happen at a scale and pace that would otherwise seem unimaginable.
Hmm. Well, yeah, I'd love to see some of that come into play. I mean, I think that we're at a really, obviously you could probably say this about a lot of different times, but it just feels like we're in a pivotal moment in humanity right now where it's kind of the fringe is taking over, and the reality is that most people do believe in humanity and human rights, and I constantly preach, everyone needs to know we're on team humanity together. Um, but hopefully we can find a way to kind of pull those messages to the top.
Yeah, and look, I will say we're really fortunate, without naming names. I mean, we have been working with top elected officials of both parties who are sane, who are trying to get us out of this, corporate leaders, cultural influencers, like, there is an appetite for this. People are exhausted. Probably the the most common statement I've heard since the pandemic from my most libertarian friends to my most progressive friends is some version of, am I crazy or did the whole country go crazy like overnight? Like, because and it's that, I guarantee you most of the listeners have some feeling like that. Like, what happened? And it's like once you realize in some way nothing happened. We're still the same people. Look, we're divided on a few things, but if you look on our website, we have a lot of our private opinion reports. If you read through them, it is shocking how much we have in common, especially when it comes to core American values. Those are not gone. It just feels like they're slipping away. And what's really important here is under a collective illusion, the way out of it is not persuasion. It's not moral panic because like think about the individual rights. It is still a top priority for the future of the country for every demographic group. They just don't believe that it's true. They think most people don't care about it anymore. So if we start saying, "Oh my goodness, people don't care about individual rights. We've got to protect them." What that tells people is, "Oh, I guess this is true. People don't really believe in them anymore. Why would everyone be so up in arms about it?" With collective illusions, the way out of it is social proof. It is revealing our shared values rather than trying to persuade. And when you try to persuade, you actually make it worse. And if you don't mind, I'll give you one concrete example of that. The In the 1990s, the U.S. government got really worried about first-time drug use was increasing for teenagers, and their response was they spent over $1 billion on a massive ad campaign. You probably remember them, the Say No to Drugs. It was really effective as an ad campaign. Over 6 years, the typical teenager saw 3 ads a day telling them not to do drugs. Well, the underlying problem was that whole campaign had assumed that the reason kids were trying drugs was because they were interested in drugs. But there was plenty of private opinion that they didn't look at the time that said that wasn't true. That kids were really skeptical about drugs. What they wanted was to fit in. And American teenagers at the time were under the illusion that most teenagers did drugs. Okay, so into that illusion, you dump $1 billion worth of advertisements trying to scare kids straight. What they took from it was, this must be what we do because why would adults try so hard to get us to stop? So the net effect, no kidding, was an increase in first time drug use directly attributed to the campaign itself. So we've got these illusions. Moral panic is not the way out of them. A confidence in our basic norms that animate free society in terms of tolerance and free speech and respectful conversation will do the trick. And these illusions will shatter, and you will be shocked at what we'll be able to accomplish together.
Yeah, well, hope we can get there. Um, and I mean, I think a lot of these sort of topics that we're discussing and perspectives apply a lot to the education system as well. We've talked about throughout this conversation how it's for so long, an unbelievable amount of time, it's been one size fits all education system. We are starting to make some waves to get out of that. What are your general thoughts on how we can make the education system more applicable to more students?
Yeah. So this is a great example of, so we've been studying trade-off priorities that the public has for education. We using these private opinion methods that don't just not just what you'll say out loud, but what you privately think, and not just that, you can't have everything in education, right? There's limited resources and limited time. So what I want to know is, what do people prioritize? What are they willing to sacrifice, and what aren't they willing to sacrifice? So we have longitudinal data that started before the pandemic, two waves during the pandemic, and we just collected a final wave. We'll be coming out in September with this data. But if I could sum it up in a very simple thing, people want different, not better. They don't want a better mousetrap. They don't want what the system does right now. They want it to be different. They want it to focus on their children's individuality. They want it to be about developing their full potential. They want it to focus on a broader range of things, including character and relationships and practical things like, being able to get a decent job and have a decent career. Um, what's interesting though is the massive, massive collective illusion there, which is when we ask people not just what they think, what do they think most people would say? You get a completely different set of trade-off priorities. So the American public is unified across demographics that they want different, not better, but they believe that they are a very small minority. They think that the overwhelming majority of people in the country are happy with the system we have right now. So I'll give you a concrete example. The role of standardized tests, like, bell curve tests. So across all demographics, the public does not want them. I mean, like something like the SAT is about as honestly is about as popular as a STD at this point. Like for privately, people do not want it. They don't want their kid judged that way. They know it's terrible. They want to know. They want mastery assessments. What does my kid know? I don't care how my kid compares to the kid sitting next to him. So they rank that as one of the bottom priorities for the entire system, but they actually think that most people think it's a top priority for the system. So what happens, especially with a collective decision like public education, where unless if I'm rich, I could get a private solution, but assume I can't. Well, the only way it's going to change is if we want it to change, like the collective we. If I think most people are happy with the system we have, why would I put any effort into trying to change it? Right? So the first thing for us is we've got to shatter these illusions around education so that we recognize our shared values for what we want it to be. And then we've got an entire playbook about how you intervene in these systems to help transform them. And I think there's a lot of our shared colleagues and that we know that are really working hard to transform these systems. I actually think it's more likely to happen than not now because the pandemic led people to just be they're so fed up with the status quo, and I think we got a great opportunity.
Yeah, we absolutely do. And you were mentioning earlier how Populace has resources that entrepreneurs and innovators can access. So, if I'm someone in, say, the ed tech space that's looking to utilize some of your resources, what's the process?
So yeah, so uh, our whole business model is we're trying to be like a boutique think tank where it's uh, small as possible, big as impact as possible. So we have some really close partnerships with high leverage entities, right? That have the capital, the labor, the technological capabilities to really move the needle on these leverage points. So that's how we focus our limited time. If people are interested, I'm happy to share some of our approaches. Our playbook we don't make public because there are plenty of people who benefit from the incumbent system. The last thing in the world I want to do is actually give them a sneak peek into how we're actually trying to transform that system.
Yeah,
So
no,
if
that
people
that
are
makes
interested in,
sense.
in the transformation, I'm happy to share, but we don't just make it publicly available.
Understood. Yeah, no, thanks for sharing. That makes a lot of sense. Um, do you have any stories that come to mind when you think of when you really saw how the work that you're doing can really affect change?
Yeah. Yeah. And I'll say when I say the work we're doing, I really do mean a sort of royal we because this wasn't just me, but I'll give you one example from a while ago. It was small, but like it really, really changed my mind in a pretty profound way about like what we needed to do. It was a study, and this one was in education, even though we do a lot of other things. And it was some of my colleagues had it was a grade school science notebook. This is how specific it was, and they had a control group that got to use the normal writing one in a journal, and then we built using only open source technology a digital version that was designed for full flexibility rather than on average. So it had reading support for like 6th grade levels different. So it had language translation on the fly. It had vocabulary support. It had multiple representations. Just everything you can imagine. It's used in a process called universal design for learning. Um, and implementing that and watching what happened. And I'm gonna tell you this is one kid, but on average it worked really well too. But there's this one kid in South Carolina. The teacher had, we'll call him Billy. The teacher had agreed to be part of the group. She hated technology, but she was like, this kid has a scientific mind, but he's profoundly dyslexic. And he was really struggling and didn't engage. And she said, if this could reach him, it would be worth it. So we implement it. Luckily, Billy gets into the experimental group with the digital notebook. And, we're hearing reports every week about this kid getting better and other things happening. And I went back, and if I hadn't seen it for myself, I wouldn't believe it. But 12 weeks later, we walk into this classroom, and about half the students, they were in the process of working on their science notebooks. About half the students were huddled around this kid's desk, Billy, and he was holding court and he was explaining everything to people. Turned out he was so freaking smart. And it's like right now, for most kids, everything's a reading test. Well, we already know this kid's is a struggling reader. What we want to know is, what does he know about science? And it turns out he knew a hell of a lot. And watching this kid just blossom and his confidence grow and everybody else recognizing him for what he was really capable of. And that, like, what did we really do there? Nothing magical. We just removed arbitrary obstacles in the form of average based design. And we did it using only open source technologies that were freely available to anybody. And I just felt like education is the last industry that still designs on average, the last one. And we now have the know how and the technology to create an incredibly good fit for every kid in this country. It is really possible. It's not a lack of resources or technology, it is a lack of willpower. And that is rooted a little bit in our misunderstanding. And so for me, I felt like if if we could help that one kid's life change with one small change in the design of one small part of a curriculum, what happens when an entire education system is rooted around these principles of individuality and human potential and is built to design flexible environments, assuming every kid is capable of excellence? I mean, that's what's possible. And so for me, that kind of thing keeps me going, because I think we do that in education, we do it in our other institutions, and we can get back to a society that our founders could only have ever dreamt of. And I think that is right at our fingertips if we want it.
Yeah, I appreciate that optimism and hope you're right in terms of being right at our fingertips. I certainly have seen a lot of great productivity in these areas, especially in education. Like you said, some people in our circles that are doing some tremendous work on education. So uh, it's good to hear that there's good stuff going on.
Just remember, under transformative change, change isn't linear. So we will always be surprised. It will feel like it's impossible. It'll feel like we've been trying forever. And then you'll start hitting that part of the curve and the change will happen, and it will feel almost qualitative, like almost like it changed overnight. So it's like we shouldn't get discouraged. We understand how to intervene in the systems. We know the public wants this, and we know what to do. So it's hard work. It's not going to be easy, but it is possible. And I don't see why, given what's at stake in our society. I mean, we right now we're at risk at losing the American experiment. We really are. And I don't mean that like we should be totally panicked, but even under illusions, we can lose this experiment. So we should be working like our hair is on fire. We should be rooted in our shared values, and we should push to show off what free societies can really do. And again, that's for me. I work in it every day, and I'm more optimistic today than I was when I started.
That's a good sign. I certainly think that we generally have especially in our media, a bias toward negativity. There's a lot of amazing work going on in our world, and thank you for being a big part of it. So, one question I like to ask some things about childhood. I'm curious, do you have any memories as a kid that showed you the importance of giving back?
Yeah, I mean, we've covered some of these in the sense that like the memories with like Marilyn Diamond and other things, to me those are giving back. And maybe there's a better way to frame it than that, but the memories I have about giving back are almost always come back to the things that often matter are actually pretty small to the giver. They're almost never these grand gestures. I mean, I'm sure that happens and I'm sure they can be valuable, but I could give you a dozen examples of people who, because they believed in other people and took a little bit of effort to put that into action rather than just words, had an enormous impact on me. And so I always think of giving back as just less about an obligation to give back. I know it sounds like I'm circular there, and more about I'm going to try to make a contribution, and I believe everybody wants to live good lives, and I believe them living a good life is good for me, and I'm going to do what I can to play a small role in that. And again, my life, I would not be where I am if other people didn't feel that sense of obligation to give back and help other people be able to realize their dreams too.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And for so many people that comes naturally, like it sounds like it did for Marilyn Diamond, and um, I'm glad that we're recognizing it. In terms of people that you consider a mentor, you mentioned Kurt Fisher previously. Anyone else or anything about mentorship that comes to mind?
Yeah, so Kurt Fisher, a big mentor. I'm very lucky throughout my second version of my education to have some really incredible mentors. Um, at Weber State, it was a professor named Bill McVaugh, and I'll share you one story about that. So I had been going to school for 2 years at Weber State. I had done well, but I was working full time, to put food on the table. And Bill McVaugh told me, he said, "Listen, I think you have what it takes to go to grad school." Now, no one in my family had ever gone to grad school. I didn't know anyone who had gone to grad school, but I believed Dr. McVaugh that I was capable of that. But he said, "Listen, for you to get into a school that you want to go to from Weber State, you're going to need to do some research, right? Let's get you your name on a publication, but when are you going to have time to do that?" I was going to school at night from 5 to 8:30, 4 nights a week, and then working full time. So I had to decide whether to take the gamble and bet on myself completely by trying to get some work study at Weber State, I'm gonna take a pay cut, and I wasn't even making very much, but nothing seemed to be available. And then all of a sudden, I got a call from the psychology department, and they said, "Good news, a new position just opened up for a work study in our department, and your job, and basically I'll get to like just be in the department, take my classes, and basically allowed me to do research, and it paid just enough for me to be able to still feed my family." What I found out after Dr. McVaugh passed away, um, was that he went to the department and offered to teach a fifth class. He needed to teach 4 classes a semester, um, and then gave all the money back to the department so they could hire me. And the only condition was that I was not to know. I mean, like, so I am really blessed to have people who believed in me, people who mentored me, um, and people who saw what I could become well before I even saw it.
Yeah. Yeah, and we talked about how you were fortunate to have some of those people in your life, and not everyone is. And hopefully, through some of these change efforts, we're going to be opening more of those doors and giving more of those opportunities to kids that really have that potential that no one really is telling them they have.
And I think this is one of the things that's going to come about from COVID, because in all of our data on the public right now, there is this craving for connection, craving to rebuild the civic society we had, where we really did take an interest in the lives of other people in our communities. We decimated that. Robert Putnam's book Bowling Alone did probably the best job articulating that of anything I've read. People want to connect again, not online. And our kids right now have struggled. They've dealt with mental health issues. But the good news is we can all do something about that by just giving back a little, just giving a little time to our youth. And again, so many people think, well, what do I have to offer, right? Or what can I do? Just trust me. Like, you have no idea what kind of impact you can make. And I've been on the receiving end and the giving end of it, and it is unbelievably rewarding on each side.
Yeah. Definitely. I hope listeners take that with them and put it into action. Um, so if everything were to end tomorrow, what are you most proud of?
I well, I think, besides my family, right, which I think is the easy answer. It's true, but it's the easy answer. Um, I'm really proud, just selfishly. I'm really proud that I've had a chance and I've done to try to live what I see as the American dream. That I've consistently now learned to make bets on myself, not just to go along to get along. And I get to wake up every single day and do just the things that I care about and the things that I believe will make for a better world. And it may not ever turn out to be anything, but I can live with that, knowing that I was able to be a part of something and give it my best.
Yeah, I mean that certainly sounds fulfilling and like a path that many people want to be on. So I commend you for that.
Thank you.
If you'd like, you can ask me a question.
Okay, I have two questions. Um, so besides this interview, 'cause we go ahead and set that aside. Um, is there is there an interview you've done that you wish more people would listen to, right? Like, because you know how it goes. Like sometimes, just for whatever reason, really amazing things just end up flying under the radar. Is there in your sort of catalog of stuff? What's the interview that you're like, if everyone listening now would just go listen to one other episode, what would it be?
Yeah, it's a great question. Appreciate that. I mean, I'd say probably Alice Marie Johnson. She was an absolutely tremendous guest. It is one of my more listened to episodes, but she is just a remarkable human being, and the spirit that she maintains after all that she's been through is just amazing. And I'll throw a second one in there from my first season, Mo Brown, a good friend of mine who's an amazing person. You know, played college football, ran for Congress, is just good people all around, and he was a great interview.
Okay, so now your audience has their marching orders, right?
Right.
Perfect. Second one is, in your life, if you could go back to your 18-year-old self or somewhere around there, like what's the piece of advice you'd give yourself, knowing how your life's played out now, knowing how things are, knowing how you felt back then? What advice would you give your younger self?
Well, as someone that's really into like time travel content, I don't want to step on any butterflies and mess with my current life that I enjoy. But assuming that's not the case, I think for me, one of the biggest things is just to know that I'm not in a rush. I think that was one of the biggest things for me. I just felt like I was in a rush to be successful, in a rush to have a family, in a rush to do a lot of things. And certainly life is short in many ways, but it's also, you have time, and there's people who didn't build the career they wanted until their 40s or 50s. I mean, I think Morgan Freeman started acting in like his 50s or something, for example. And so I try to keep that in mind now, just that there's still plenty of time to develop plenty of things that might not exist yet. Um, so really just slow down and enjoy it.
That's a great answer. I like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Good
All right, well, you're
question.
off the hook now. All right.
Yeah. Thank you. And, the big question that I ask every guest is this: if you could snap your fingers and fix one thing in the world, what would it be? And how do you think that change would reverberate?
Well, my honest answer would come back to some of the stuff that we do here, and it's around the social trust thing. And social trust is just your gut feeling. Can most people be trusted to make decisions in their own life? And that social trust is one of the best predictors of almost everything that matters in a free society, for obvious reasons, right? Like, again, if I don't trust you, if I think your choices are going to hurt me, then I'm not going to let you make those choices. And we're seeing that play out in our society right now. Right now in America, we have some of the lowest levels of social trust ever recorded. And ever since the 1930s, every generation has had lower levels of social trust than the preceding generation. And free societies don't function. They just don't. And if you have that low levels of social trust, if you got to high levels of social trust, then we will be able to finally take the lid off what free society can be, and we will be able to cultivate the full potential of people, giving them more choices in their lives, allowing them to pursue their unique potentialities, and we will benefit in ways that are just unfathomable right now. I mean, I see it as the psychological equivalent of Adam Smith realizing that mercantilism and zero sum economics wasn't true. That like you could trade and you could divide labor and like, and we would have abundance. That seems absurd until it isn't. And then we all know the sort of hockey stick of GDP, right? And like we, we've arguably made more material progress in the last couple hundred years than in all of human history before it. And we are so think about what happens with high levels of social trust when everyone in this country is on a path to a truly fulfilling life. Like just, I mean, I think we're on the cusp of that psychological equivalent of discovering free markets, and so that's my hope.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's incredible how pivotal social trust can be. And I hope we're on a path to really open that up and be in that society that you are envisioning here.
Well, the good news, last I'll say, is circling back to collective illusions. So the shared values are the moral foundation of social trust. So all else equal, I don't know anything else about you, but if I believe you share my fundamental values, I am likely to trust you. So it's bad enough if we actually don't share values and we distrust each other. Think how awful it is that this distrust is being driven by a bunch of collective illusions. That you look around and you see people who you think disagree with you on things that matter most, when in fact they are part of your group. So that's what gives me hope. We know how to break these illusions, and we believe that social trust is going to be one of the increases in social trust will be one of the consequences of getting rid of these illusions.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for sharing. Thanks for being here. I'm sure plenty of our listeners would love to follow up further. I'm certainly going to link to your books. How else can people support you and your impact?
Yeah, I mean, follow me on social media. Like, the biggest thing is just like if everyone could do one thing, which is listen, we now live in a society where you can't trust your brain to tell you what your group thinks. So accept that fact and realize that we have to take responsibility for our own beliefs and behavior. And it sounds silly, but we have to be what we want in the world. And our commitment to our values, if we're willing to live them, will be the example for other people. We will stop self silencing and we will get back on the path to building a more perfect union.
Yeah, very well said, and appreciate it. And thanks again so much for joining me here. And I look forward to continuing our conversation.
Great. Thanks for having me. Good to see you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of People Are the Answer. To find out more, go to peoplearetheanswer.com.